Welcome. Thank you for joining me for this story, a quiet tale to help you drift away. There is nothing to worry about here, just a calm, unhurried story to accompany you into your rest. So find a comfortable position. Let your body feel heavy and supported, and allow my voice to be a gentle guide, something to focus on as your own thoughts begin to soften and fade. We are going to a place of warm sun and cool ocean breezes. We are going back in time to a stretch of the California coast in 1972. The hills of Southern California in those years were a shade of dusty gold for most of the year. They rolled down toward the Pacific Ocean like the sleeping shoulders of giants, covered in dry grass and sagebrush that smelled of dust and wild herbs in the afternoon sun. This was a landscape of gentle, rounded shapes, where the land met the sea not with sharp cliffs, but with soft sloping bluffs and wide sandy coves. In one of these spaces, nestled between the larger, older cities, was a new town. It was called Laguna Niguel. It was a place born of a plan, a dream of suburban quiet laid out on the ancient coastal chaparral. The houses were new, with terracotta tile roofs that glowed orange in the setting sun. The streets were wide and clean, curving gracefully with the contours of the land. It was a community built for families, for a life lived outdoors under the reliable California sun. The air itself felt new here, scrubbed clean by the constant gentle breeze that drifted in from the ocean. You could taste the salt in it, a faint, clean taste that reminded you always how close you were to the water. In 1972, Laguna Niguel was still growing, still finding its rhythm. It was a place of quiet ambition, where the future felt as open and vast as the blue horizon of the Pacific. It wasn't a place of secrets. It was a place of picture windows and green lawns, of weekend barbecues and children's bicycles left lying in the driveway. The loudest sounds were often the distant laughter from a backyard pool, or the rhythmic sigh of the waves breaking on the shore a few miles away. At the heart of this new, sleepy community, in a small shopping center, stood a building like many others. It was a branch of the United California Bank, a low, modest structure of modern design, with clean lines and large windows. It was meant to look friendly, approachable. It was a place of quiet transactions, of whispered conversations through thick glass. It was a neighborhood bank, a part of the daily fabric of life for the people who lived in these golden hills. It held their savings, their plans, their small paper-bound dreams. And like the town around it, the bank had a rhythm. Their slow, predictable pulse that was easy to learn, easy to know. The rhythm of the bank was the rhythm of the town. It began early, before the doors were unlocked. The sun would rise over the Saddleback Mountains to the east, casting long, soft shadows across the parking lot. A car or two would arrive. An employee perhaps carrying a briefcase and a morning coffee. The lights inside would flicker on one by one, a quiet awakening. Then at the appointed hour, the heavy glass doors would be unlocked, and the business of the day would begin with a soft, metallic click. Throughout the morning, there was a gentle flow of people. Neighbors stopping in to cash a check, small business owners making a deposit. The sounds were muted, respectful. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the quiet thud of a rubber stamp, the low murmur of voices. It was a place of order, of calm procedure. The tellers behind the counter knew many of their customers by name. They would ask about their families, about their weekend plans. It was a place of community, as much as it was a place of commerce. As the morning sun climbed higher, the town would settle into its day. The initial flurry of activity would subside. The bank would grow even quieter. The sun would stream through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. An hour could pass with only one or two people coming through the doors. The rhythm slowed to a crawl, a deep and peaceful midday stillness. This was the time of day when the ocean breeze seemed to make its way farthest inland, carrying the scent of salt and kelp through the open doors of shops and into the quiet halls of buildings like this one. It was a reminder that even here, amidst the neat ledgers and balanced accounts, the wild, ancient presence of the Pacific was never far away. In the late afternoon, the rhythm would pick up again just for a little while. People on their way home from work would stop by for one last transaction, a final gentle surge before the close of business, and then, as the sun began its slow descent toward the ocean, the doors would be locked once more. The employees would finish their work, The lights would go out and the building would be left to the quiet of the evening. It would stand silent under the stars, listening to the crickets and the distant rush of the surf. This was its cycle, a simple, predictable, and deeply peaceful rhythm. The bank, like the town, would sleep. And in its sleep, it trusted the quiet of the community, the neatness of its streets, the goodness of its people. It was a trusting place in a trusting time, and it was this deep, trusting quiet that traveled, like a story whispered on the wind, all the way across the country. The story traveled to a different world entirely, a world of steel and smoke, of grey skies and hard-working towns built along the banks of wide, muddy rivers. It traveled to northeast Ohio. In the early 1970s, this was the heart of America's industrial power, a place of foundries and factories where life had a different rhythm. It was a rhythm of shift whistles and machinery, of tough winters and humid summers. It was a place where things were made, where people worked with their hands. It was a landscape of brick and concrete, a world away from the sun-drenched hills of Southern California. And in this world, there was a man named Amil Dinsio. He was from Youngstown, Ohio, a city known for its steel mills, for its tough, no-nonsense character. Amil and the small group of men he worked with were products of this environment. They were methodical, patient, and incredibly disciplined. They were not impulsive. They were planners. They thought of their work as a craft, a trade that required immense skill, quiet observation, and an almost artistic level of precision. They were known in certain circles for their quiet competence. They moved without making noise. They planned without leaving notes. Their greatest tool was their patience. When the whispers of the quiet bank in the sleepy California town reached them, it was the quiet that interested them most. Not the money, not at first. It was the character of the place. They were men who understood rhythms. They knew how to listen to the heartbeat of a building, of a town. And the heartbeat they heard from Laguna Niguel was slow, steady, and deeply, deeply calm. It was a puzzle that intrigued them, a challenge not of force but of finesse. So they traveled west. They left the gray skies of Ohio and drove across the country into the bright, unending sunshine of California. The change in the landscape was stark. The flat industrial plains gave way to the vast, empty deserts of the southwest, and then, finally, to the coastal mountains and the sparkling blue of the Pacific. For men accustomed to the close-knit, gritty cities of the Midwest, Southern California must have felt like another planet. The air was different. The light was different. The people were different, with their sun-tanned skin and easygoing manner. They arrived not as a gang, but as a handful of tourists. Brothers, cousins, old friends. They blended in easily. They found a place to stay. A rented condominium with a view of the rolling hills, and from this quiet perch they began their work. And their work for now was simply to watch, to listen, to learn the song of this sleepy coastal town. They brought their own quiet with them, a deep industrial quiet from the world of steel, and they laid it over the sunny suburban quiet of Laguna Niguel. And they waited. One of the younger men, looking out at the neat rows of houses, at the palm trees swaying in the breeze, might have said, "It's a quiet place," and Amil, watching the sun glint off the distant ocean, would have nodded slowly. "That's good," he would reply. "Quiet is good." Their art was the art of watching. It was a slow, meditative practice, a form of deep listening. They did not rush. They had come a long way, and time was a tool they understood better than any other. From their temporary home, and from different vantage points around the small town, they began to absorb its rhythms, to make the town's pulse their own. They watched the sun. They noted where it rose in the morning, how it cast long shadows from the bank's low roof. They watched how those shadows shortened at midday, leaving the building exposed and bright under the high, clear sun. And they watched as the shadows grew long again in the afternoon, stretching eastward, until the building was bathed in the warm, golden light of the approaching sunset. They watched the traffic. They saw the morning rush, a gentle surge of station wagons and sedans heading toward the freeway. They saw the midday lull when the wide streets were mostly empty, shimmering in the heat. They saw the school buses in the afternoon, and the return of the commuters in the evening. They learned the traffic patterns like a sailor learns the tides. They knew which roads were busy and which were always quiet. They knew the sound of the garbage truck on a Tuesday morning and the mailman's jeep in the early afternoon. They spent days just observing the bank itself. not with binoculars from a hidden car, but casually, naturally. They would park in the shopping center's large open lot. They would go into the grocery store next door, or the small diner across the way. They sat and drank coffee, watching the bank through the window. They saw the employees who opened up in the morning and the ones who locked up at night. They saw how few people were around after dark, how the shopping center became a vast, empty space under the stars, visited only by the occasional patrol car making a slow, lazy loop. Through this patient observation, an idea began to take shape. It was an idea born from the landscape itself. The bank, they noticed, was built on a slight slope. The land fell away behind it, and nearby there was a patch of undeveloped land, a sweep of hillside covered in thick brush and eucalyptus trees, their leaves rustling constantly in the ocean breeze. The idea was about the earth, about the space beneath things, about the quiet, hidden world that exists just under the surface of our busy, visible lives. They weren't looking at the doors or the windows. They were looking at the ground the building stood upon. They were thinking about a different way in, a slower, quieter, more patient path. This was the core of their plan. It wasn't about speed or force. It was about finding a seam in the fabric of the town's routine. It was about using the town's own peacefulness as their cover. They knew that on a long weekend, a holiday weekend, that peacefulness would deepen. The town would exhale, it would relax, and its attention would be turned elsewhere, to the beaches, to backyard gatherings, to family. That would be their window, a pocket of time when the town was so quiet, so deeply at rest, that a small, persistent noise from beneath the ground might go completely unnoticed, lost in the sound of the wind and the distant sea. The plan was not to break in. It was to dig their way in slowly, carefully, from the wild, untended earth into the clean, orderly heart of the vault. It was a plan that required a profound understanding of the place, and a level of patience that was almost geological in its scope. Sleepy notes. Historians and investigators have often debated how Amil Dinsio and his crew first learned about the United California Bank. Some accounts suggest a tip from a contact who knew about the bank's alarm system specifics and the potential for a large holiday weekend cash reserve. Others believe the group chose it themselves after careful research, simply identifying it as a perfect example of a quiet, suburban bank with predictable routines and a favorable location for their unique method of entry. The condominium they rented was on a hillside, overlooking a canyon. From the sliding glass door in the living room, you could see the tops of other buildings, the neat patterns of rooftops and swimming pools descending toward the coast. In the distance on a clear day, the ocean was a sharp, dark blue line. This was their base, their temporary home. And for weeks, it was a place of profound and disciplined quiet. To any neighbor, they were just a group of men on an extended vacation. Perhaps they were in real estate, or simply enjoying the California weather, away from the harsh winters of the East. Their life in the condo was deliberately, almost performatively, normal. They bought groceries at the local supermarket. They did their laundry. In the mornings, the smell of coffee would fill the small kitchen. One of them would sit at the Formica dining table, reading the local paper, studying the rhythms of the community, not with a plotter's mind, but with the simple curiosity of a newcomer. They spoke little about the work to come. Their communication was often non-verbal, a look, a nod. They had worked together for a long time. They understood each other. The tools they had brought with them, or acquired locally, were stored neatly out of sight. There was no clutter, no mess. Their discipline extended to their living space. Everything was orderly. Everything had its place. It was a reflection of their mindset. Calm, prepared, and leaving nothing to chance. The evenings were the quietest time. The sun would set, and the sky over the Pacific would blaze with orange and purple. The lights of the town would begin to twinkle on in the valley below. They would sit on the small balcony, the air cooling around them, and listen to the sounds of the evening, the chirp of crickets, the distant hum of traffic on the Pacific Coast Highway, the faint sound of a television from a neighboring apartment. They were embedded in the life of the town, invisible within it. They were letting its peace soak into them, becoming a part of the quiet they planned to use. This period of waiting was not idle. It was an essential part of their process. It was an act of acclimation. They were attuning their own internal clocks, born of the factory whistle and the harsh seasons of Ohio, to the sun and surf rhythm of Southern California. They were letting the tension drain out of them, replacing it with the calm, patient energy that the job would require. They were not thieves counting down the hours. They were craftsmen, preparing their minds and bodies for a delicate and demanding task. They were like fishermen, watching the water for days, waiting for the precise moment when the tide and the wind and the fish would all align. In the quiet of their hillside condo, they were waiting for the town to fall into its deepest sleep. And they knew that sleep was coming. The end of March approached, and with it a long weekend. The air in Laguna Niguel began to change. There was a subtle shift in the town's energy, a collective feeling of anticipation. You could feel it in the grocery stores, which were a little more crowded as people stocked up for family gatherings. You could hear it in the voices of people on the street, a lighter, more relaxed tone. The long weekend was a promise of rest, of a pause in the normal routine. For the town, it was a time to exhale. For the men from Ohio, it was the opposite. It was the time to hold their breath. On that Friday afternoon, a warm, sunny day, the rhythm of the town began to slow down earlier than usual. Offices closed at noon. The traffic heading out of town toward vacation spots was heavier than the traffic coming in. The United California Bank performed its final transactions, the heavy glass doors closing and locking for the last time for what would be a 3-day holiday. The employees wished each other a good weekend and walked out into the bright sunshine, their footsteps echoing in the emptying parking lot. The shopping center grew quiet. The sun beat down on the vast expanse of asphalt. One by one, the other stores and businesses closed their doors. A profound stillness began to settle over the commercial heart of the town. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the beginning of the great quiet. Back in the condo on the hillside, the atmosphere was calm and focused. The television was off. The radio was silent. They made their final preparations in near silence, each man knowing his task. The tools were gathered. The plan, which had lived only in their minds, was ready to be put into motion. As evening fell, one of the younger men stood by the window, looking out as the last light faded from the sky. He might have felt a flutter of nerves, a knot of anticipation in his stomach. He watched the headlights of the cars on the distant roads, each one a small separate life, a story moving through the twilight, completely unaware of theirs. Amil Dinsio came and stood beside him for a moment. He put a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low and calm. The young man nodded, not taking his eyes off the darkening landscape. "Ready," he said. And with that, they picked up their bags, walked out the door of the condo for the last time, and descended into the warm, fragrant California night. The drive was slow and deliberate. It was a Friday night, but the streets of Laguna Niguel were already peaceful. The main arteries had a trickle of traffic, but the side roads, the residential streets that wound through the hills, were all but deserted. The car moved through the pools of light cast by the street lamps, its engine a low, steady hum in the quiet air. The windows were down, and the night air rushed in, cool and smelling of jasmine and damp earth. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The time for talking and planning was long past. Now was the time for quiet action. Each man was alone with his thoughts, watching the familiar landmarks of the town slide by in the darkness. The gas station, the movie theater, the high school, places they had studied for weeks, places that had become as familiar to them as their own neighborhoods back in Ohio. But tonight, these places looked different. They were softer, less real, as if they were part of a dream. The town was asleep, and they were the only ones awake, moving with purpose through its slumbering landscape. They drove past the shopping center. It was a ghost of its daytime self. The large parking lot was empty, a sea of dark asphalt under the pale glow of the security lights. The storefronts were dark, their windows reflecting the streetlights like vacant eyes. The bank stood at the corner of the lot, a solid, silent shadow. It looked inert, a building holding its breath. There were no signs of life. No patrol cars, no late-night wanderers. There was only the sound of their own car's tires on the pavement and the whisper of the wind through the tall eucalyptus trees that bordered the property. They didn't park in the lot. They continued past, turning onto a small unlit access road that ran behind the shopping center. They pulled the car into the deep shadows of the trees on the undeveloped hill beside the bank. Here the darkness was almost total. The lights of the town were filtered through the thick leaves. When the engine was cut, the silence that rushed in was immense. For a moment they just sat, letting their eyes adjust to the gloom. The only sounds were the crickets, 1,000 tiny clicking voices filling the night, and the distant rhythmic sigh of the ocean. It was a sound that had been here for 1,000,000 years, and would be here for 1,000,000 more. It was the sound of a deep and ancient indifference. It was the perfect sound to cover their work. They opened the car doors, slowly, carefully, so as not to make a loud metallic click, and stepped out into the cool, dark earth of the hillside. The work began. It was not a loud or violent act. It was a quiet, patient process, more like archaeology than robbery. They started on the wild hillside, under the cover of the eucalyptus trees. The ground was soft from recent spring rains. The first sounds were the soft scrape and scoop of shovels biting into the earth. It was a rhythmic, meditative sound, a sound that blended easily with the chirping of the crickets and the rustle of the leaves overhead. They worked in the dark, using only small shielded flashlights that cast pools of yellow light on the ground at their feet. They were moving downward into the earth. The air grew cooler as they dug, and the smell of the damp soil was rich and heavy. They were leaving the world of sight and entering a world of touch and sound. The feel of the shovel in their hands, the resistance of a hidden root, the soft crumble of dirt. It was hard, physical labor, but it was performed with a quiet efficiency that made it seem almost effortless. There was no wasted motion, no hurried action, just a steady, relentless progress. Hours passed. The moon, a pale sliver, climbed higher in the sky, its weak light barely penetrating the canopy of trees. Above them, the town of Laguna Niguel slept on. In the houses on the surrounding hills, people were dreaming. The life of the town continued in its unconscious state, completely unaware of the small, determined group of men digging their way into its foundations. The bank stood silent and dark, an island of stillness in the sleeping landscape. The digging was only the first part. The destination was the concrete floor of the vault. To reach it, they had to pass through the earth and then through the thick foundation of the building. This was the part that required the most patience. The sounds changed. The soft scraping of shovels was replaced by a dull, rhythmic tapping. A persistent, determined sound, but one that was baffled by the tons of earth above them. To anyone walking by on the street, it would have been inaudible, completely lost in the ambient sounds of the night. Down in the darkness, it was the only sound in their world. One man would work for a time, and then another would take his place, the rhythm of the tapping never breaking, a whispered exchange in the dark. "My turn. All right. Take it." The work was methodical. Time seemed to stretch and dissolve. There was no day or night down here, only the constant, focused task at hand. They were in a space between spaces, a hidden corridor of their own making, moving slowly and deliberately toward the still, silent heart of the sleeping bank. The work was a slow conversation with the concrete, to her question asked with a sharp point, and an answer that came back as a puff of fine grey dust. Again and again. The hours blended into one long, continuous effort, punctuated only by the swapping of one tired man for another. The world above them turned. The sun of Saturday rose, warmed the empty parking lot, and began its slow arc across the California sky. People woke up in their quiet houses. They made breakfast. They took their children to the beach. They lived out the slow, pleasant hours of their holiday weekend, their lives unfolding in the bright sunshine, just feet above the dark. Patient work of the men from Ohio. The men in the tunnel had no sense of this passing day. Their world was the narrow beam of a flashlight, the cool metal of a tool, the gritty taste of dust on their tongues. Their bodies ached with a deep rhythmic fatigue, but their focus never wavered. They were sustained by their discipline, by the deep unspoken trust they had in one another. They were a single organism, working in the dark, a small human machine dedicated to a single, silent purpose. As Saturday bled into Saturday night, the town above them partied, gathered, and then slowly once again went to sleep. The second night of the long weekend descended, and still the work continued. The tapping was the only clock they had, a measure of time not in minutes and hours, but in inches of progress. The air in the tunnel grew thick and stale, but they worked on. They were so far removed from the normal world now, so deep inside their task, that it felt as if they had always been here, in this cool, dark earth. It felt as if they would be here forever, patiently tapping their way through the stone like water seeping through rock, until the end of time. Then something changed. It was not a loud crash or a sudden breakthrough. It was a subtle shift in resonance. The dull thud of the tool striking the concrete began to have a slight echo to it, a hollow sound that wasn't there before. The man who was working paused. He listened, his head tilted in the darkness. He tapped again, gently. The sound was different, deeper. He had reached the other side. A small hole no bigger than a coin opened up, and with it came a puff of air that was different from the earthy, humid air of the tunnel. This air was cool, dry, and perfectly still. It was the air of a sealed room, the air of the vault. They worked quietly to widen the opening, removing debris with careful hands. There was no rush, no excitement. Their discipline held even now at the moment of discovery. The hole grew large enough for a man to slip through. One of them shined a flashlight into the darkness beyond. The beam cut through the absolute black, illuminating a world of perfect order. It fell upon rows and rows of gleaming metal doors, the safe deposit boxes. They stood in silent, perfect ranks, a library of the town's private treasures. The light slid across their brushed metal surfaces, revealing the small numbered plates on each one. Slipping through the hole was like being born into a new world. From the tight, earthy confines of the tunnel, they emerged into the spacious, cool silence of the vault. The floor was clean, the walls were thick, and the silence was absolute. It was a silence deeper than any they had ever known. A silence that felt heavy, ancient. Here inside the still heart of the bank, the sounds of the outside world, the crickets, the wind, the distant ocean, were gone. All that remained was the sound of their own soft breathing, impossibly loud in the perfect stillness. They stood there for a moment, simply absorbing the feeling of the place. They had arrived. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, patient whisper. Sleepy notes. One of the enduring mysteries of the robbery is the exact amount that was stolen. Because the contents of private safe deposit boxes are known only to their owners, much of what was taken was undeclared and untraceable. Official estimates at the time were around $3 million, but later accounts from those involved suggest the true value, in cash, jewels, and other valuables, may have been more than 3 or 4 times that amount. It remains one of the largest cash heists in American history. Their work inside the vault was as quiet and methodical as their entry. It was not a frantic ransacking. It was a careful, systematic process. They moved with a calm purpose, their flashlight beams dancing across the walls of metal boxes. The sounds were small, precise. The click of a tool, the soft metallic slide of a box being removed from its housing, the quiet rustle of paper. They were like librarians, carefully sorting through a vast and silent archive. Time continued to stretch and bend. How long were they in there? A few hours? All night? It was impossible to say. In the windowless, soundproof world of the vault, time had ceased to have any meaning. There was only the task and the deep, abiding quiet. They sorted the contents, their movements economical and sure. They were not interested in everything. They were looking for the things that were easiest to carry, easiest to hide. Cash, jewels, bearer bonds. Things that held their value but lost their history, the moment they were removed from their numbered boxes. At some point, a silent agreement was reached. The work was done. It was time to go. They packed their bags, leaving the vault in a state of quiet disarray, a puzzle for those who would find it. They left the boxes they had opened sitting on the floor, a silent testament to their visit. Then, one by one, they slipped back through the hole in the floor, back into the familiar darkness of the tunnel. They sealed the opening behind them as best they could, a final act of closing the door on the silent world they had briefly inhabited. The journey back through the tunnel was quicker. Their bags were heavy now, but their steps felt lighter. They were moving toward the open air, toward the living world again. And as they emerged from the hole on the hillside, blinking into the pre-dawn gloom, the change was a shock to the senses. The air, it was the first thing they noticed. It was cool and damp and alive, smelling of dew-wet grass and the salty tang of the ocean. After so many hours breathing the stale, dusty air below, it felt like the purest thing they had ever known. The sky to the east was a pale, soft gray, the first hint of the approaching Sunday morning. The stars were beginning to fade. The world was still washed in the blue and grey tones of the night, but the promise of light was there on the horizon. The crickets had fallen silent, and in their place was the first tentative chirping of the morning birds. They stood there for a moment, letting the world wash over them, breathing in the cool, clean air. They were exhausted, their bodies aching, their faces smudged with dirt and concrete dust, but they were out. They had done it. They loaded their gear and the heavy bags into the car, their movements still quiet, still careful. The doors closed with a soft, solid thud. The engine turned over, a low rumble that seemed to fill the entire world. As they pulled away, driving slowly down the empty streets, one of them looked back at the bank, a dark shape against the lightening sky. "It's still sleeping," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. Amil, his eyes on the road ahead, simply nodded. "Let it sleep," he said. The car moved on, melting into the quiet streets of the waking town, just another vehicle in the gentle early morning light. They drove east toward the rising sun. Monday morning arrived, bright and clear. The long weekend was over. The rhythm of the town picked up again. Alarm clocks rang. Coffee percolated. Cars pulled out of driveways, their passengers restored by 3 days of rest and sunshine. The town was back to work. At the United California Bank, an employee arrived at her usual time. She unlocked the heavy glass doors, the familiar click echoing in the quiet morning air. She walked inside, enjoying the cool stillness of the building before the day began. Everything was exactly as it should be. The counters were clean, the chairs were in place, the air was still. She went about her morning routine, the small tasks she performed every day to prepare the bank for its customers. She turned on the lights, started the computers, prepared her cash drawer. There was nothing to suggest that anything was amiss. The bank felt the same as it always did, a place of calm, predictable order. It was only when the time came to open the vault that the first subtle crack appeared in the surface of the normal day. The vault was protected by a massive round steel door, a symbol of security and permanence. Opening it was a precise ritual, involving a long combination and a time lock. Another employee, the branch manager, began the procedure. He spun the dial, the soft clicks of the tumblers falling into place. But when he went to turn the large spoked handle, it wouldn't budge. He tried again. It was locked tight. This was unusual. The time lock should have disengaged. He frowned, a small flicker of annoyance. He called over the other employee. "Can you give me a hand with this?" Together they tried, their combined weight and strength against the handle. It didn't move. It was sealed. This was not right. A feeling of confusion, not yet alarm, began to spread. They called their head office. They called a locksmith. The morning passed in a slow, frustrating sequence of phone calls and waiting. The bank opened for business, but the heart of the bank, the vault, remained stubbornly sealed. It took hours for a specialist to arrive. Using special tools, he worked on the door's mechanism. Finally, with a deep groaning sound, the bolts retracted. The massive door swung inward. The manager peered inside, expecting to find a simple mechanical failure. But the sight that greeted him made no sense. The vault was perfectly still. The lights were off. But on the floor, in the center of the room, was a dark, jagged hole. And scattered around it, like fallen leaves, were dozens of empty safe deposit boxes. There was no sign of a forced entry through the door. There was no dust or debris, beyond that which was immediately around the hole. It was a scene of impossible quiet violation. The first investigators who arrived were equally puzzled. They stood in the vault, their faces illuminated by the beams of their flashlights, and tried to understand what they were seeing. One of the local policemen looked at the hole, then at the thick, reinforced concrete floor around it. "Anything?" his partner asked. The officer shook his head slowly, a look of disbelief on his face. "Just clean," he said. "It's too clean. It's like they came up from the center of the earth." The investigation began as a quiet puzzle. The FBI was called in, and they descended on the small, sleepy town of Laguna Niguel, bringing with them a different kind of energy. They were methodical, precise, and they started to look for the small details that didn't fit. They knew the thieves must have stayed somewhere nearby for a long period of time to plan such a careful operation. They began to check the rental records for every apartment, every condo, every motel in the area, and so they found it. The condominium on the hillside, rented for cash weeks before by a group of men from Ohio. When the agents entered the apartment, they found it almost perfectly clean. The men had wiped down every surface, vacuumed the carpets, and taken out the trash. They had intended to leave behind no trace of their presence. No fingerprints, no hair, no stray fibers. But they had made one small, simple, and very human mistake. In their desire to be perfectly clean, they had been a little too thorough. They had loaded all the glasses, plates, and silverware they had used into the condominium's dishwasher and run a cycle before they left. At first, this seemed like just another part of their meticulous cleanup. But to one of the FBI's forensic investigators, it was a revelation. In 1972, the science of fingerprints was well established, but the idea of recovering fingerprints from the inside of a dishwasher after a full wash cycle was almost unheard of. It was a long shot. They carefully dismantled the dishwasher, removing the rubber seal from the door and the drain trap at the bottom. And there, preserved by the water and the unique conditions inside the machine, they found them. Partial fingerprints, faint but usable. It was an echo of the men's domestic life in the condo, the quiet meals, the cups of coffee. The simple act of cleaning up after themselves had become their undoing. The sound of that dishwasher, filling and draining in the empty condo after they had gone, was the only sound they had left behind. And it was enough. The fingerprints were matched to the men from Ohio. Amil Dinsio and his crew now had names. They had faces. The invisible men had suddenly become visible. The trail led the FBI from the sunny hills of California back to the gray industrial heartland of Ohio. Warrants were issued. Arrests were made. The quiet men who had blended in so perfectly with the California landscape were brought one by one into the bright, harsh light of justice. The story of their incredible feat, the patient planning, the tunnel, the entry through the floor became a national sensation. It was a story that captured the public's imagination. It was so audacious, so clever, so unlike the violent, messy crimes that usually filled the newspapers. But the most important part of the story remained a mystery. The fortune. The millions in cash and jewels and valuables that had been lifted from the vault. It was gone. It had vanished. The FBI searched their homes, their businesses, their known associates. They found nothing. A few $1,000s here and there, but not the vast treasure they were looking for. The fortune had dissolved. It had been laundered, hidden, and absorbed into the flow of the world with the same quiet efficiency as the robbery itself. It had melted away like snow in the spring. Some of it might have bought a new car, paid off a mortgage, or been invested in a legitimate business. Some of it may have been buried in a backyard, waiting for a quieter time. It had become a ghost, a legend. The men went to prison for their crime, but the fruits of their labor remained free. Even after they served their time and returned to their lives in Ohio, the mystery of the money endured. They became local legends, the quiet, hard-working men who had gone west and pulled off the heist of the century, a suburban fortune dug out from the earth. They had returned with nothing to show for it, and yet everyone believed they had returned with everything. And now our story comes to a close. Let your mind drift back from that time, back from the golden hills of California in 1972. Let the story fade like an old photograph, its details softening at the edges. Come back to the present moment. Back to the comfort of your bed, to the stillness of your room. The town of Laguna Niguel is different now. It has grown. The sleepy new community of the 70s is now a bustling, established city. The small shopping center where the bank once stood has changed. The original building is likely gone, replaced by something newer, more modern. The wild, undeveloped hillside where the men began their work is probably covered with houses now, their bright windows looking out over the Pacific. But some things remain. The hills are still there, their shapes the same as they were 50 years ago, 1,000 years ago. The sun still rises over the mountains to the east and sets in a blaze of glory over the ocean. And the ocean itself, the great constant presence, still sighs against the shore, its rhythm unchanged. The wind still whispers through the leaves of the eucalyptus trees, carrying the scent of salt and sage. The story of the United California bank robbery is now just a part of the landscape's memory. A quiet, remarkable tale that unfolded over one long weekend and then was gone. A story of patience, of quiet, and of a fortune that simply vanished into the air. It's just a story now. And like all stories, its purpose is to gently lead us to the edge of our own quiet, the edge of our own sleep. Thank you for listening. I hope this story has brought you some measure of peace and rest. If you feel so inclined, you can leave a quiet comment to let me know you are here. For now, there is nothing left to do but breathe, in and out. Let the last pieces of the story drift away. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be peaceful. Good night.